Red 2 standing by, all 4 lit and in the green. Welcome back to Star Wars Episode 1 Racer, where we are bringing you all the news that's fit for the Hollows. And of course, we actually have a journalist on hand for today's racing session. Clegg Holdfast, who wrote for Podracing Quarterly before getting into the action himself. Will he be a capable driver, or will he wind up going down in flames? We'll have to see what he does, but we also have the crime lord Elan Mak participating as well. We will see his history and find out exactly what a master of disguise he is when we get to our racer bios. But Clegg's up first, so let's see what his pod racer's packing. Clegg Holdfast had established his name in the world of pod racing as a top-notch journalist for Podracing Quarterly. The Nosorian writer also participated in races, considering it the best way to get the inside scoop on everything that happened, though he was treated as a bit of a joke by more serious pilots. Nonetheless, he was able to make a decent fist of his career, his sturdy height enabling him to survive myriad crashes suffered. Holdfast entered the Boonta Classic in 32 BBY, but he started out fairly poorly. A deleted scene from episode 1 actually showed that he nonetheless managed to make a fairly impressive charge through the pack, reaching second place and attempting to overtake Sebulba. This was the scene where the Doug's famous flamethrower came into play. Sebulba torched Holdfast's engines and rapidly set the pod ablaze. Holdfast crashed near the narrow canyon known as the Notch, but because he was a durable Nosorian and not a small alien like Rats Tyrell, he survived. Somewhat embarrassed by the crash, Holdfast used his connections to cook the books and claim he finished in 7th place. Interestingly enough, the main element that appears in Holdfast's career other than the Boonta Classic is in the events of Star Wars Connect's pod racing mode. Holdfast would rescue and befriend the player character, knocking out Dudbolt's Trandoshan bodyguards and sending the Volpterine packing with a strike from a wrench. Holdfast's good-natured deeds and association with the new player would earn him the ire of Sebulba, who ran a rival team to Watto. Sebulba ordered Oldar Beto to kill him, and sadly this crash was one Clegg could not walk away from. However, because of the dubious canonicity of Star Wars Connect, Holdfast's death may not be regarded as canon. Either way, we don't really know very much about his pod racing career, but we can assume that he continued his journalistic endeavours for quite some time. Clegg Holdfast's Kaiser Volvec 199B Wasp pod racer is described as being a typically bland and unimaginative product from a manufacturer well known for its output being dependable yet average. The KTV Series 400 fanjet engines were actually quite capable and had the advantage of being somewhat easy to modify. They also lent themselves to excellent handling. The cockpit is 4.42 metres long, and the engines are 10.36 metres long. They could push to a top speed of 800 kilometres an hour, so it appears they're basic but very reliable. There's also a very nice zebra print cockpit. Holdfast does have pretty good traction with those bulky engines and good acceleration. His top speed is okay off the mark, air brake is terrible, but other stats will hold up alright. When we actually get to buying parts, let's see how Holdfast fares. So traction will start out fairly alright, and he'll jump out to some pretty good stats there. Fairly solid and should see you right on most races. Most racers do get particularly good turning. There's nobody who really handles like a wallowing hut. So he'll do alright in that. Acceleration will actually be a little bit higher than sort of that average mark. He'll still do pretty well. Top speed jumps up quite nicely, hitting it with a block 5. Not quite as fast as Gasgano, but still pretty quick. Air braking gets only minimal improvements at first, but starts to build up. Probably one of the worst when it actually comes to braking. However, his cooling, as we can see, will wind up being fairly decent. Nothing outstanding, but it does the job well enough. and his repair systems will also do particularly well. So you might find that Holdfast remains a very capable racer, all the way through, not bad for just a journalist. A good journalist knows how to meet a deadline, and Clegg Holdfast is pretty consistent when it comes to those times, all within about 7/10 of a second, making for very impressive performances, which might catch a few people off guard given that he is essentially just a reporter and sometimes seen as a bit of a joke. Nonetheless, he has done very well in this game despite what his bio said about him. Clegg Holdfast's time clocks in at 2 minutes 1.235 seconds, which is enough to put him 4th on the lap board. Definitely able to put his money where his mouth is in this game, and a racer that will not steer you wrong. Now, as for Elan Mak, who's coming up next, well, that's another matter entirely. Elan Mak's actual name was Cam Nail, so you can see the magnificence of his disguise skills on display right away. He did not actually start out with any involvement in pod racing, instead being the son of the Flugrian crime lord Borzu Nail. Cam would take control of his father's empire a little earlier than anticipated when the Glimford hitman Oldar Bedo assassinated Borzu. Bedo needed little motivation as the Glimfords and Flugrians had been warring for countless years. A rival smuggler, Oren Nile, had wanted Borzu gone. Cam did not know who had killed his father at first, but after plenty of tracking, he would discover that Bedo was responsible. He entered the Bunta Classic with a complete junker, a Kurtob 410C, with his goal being to kill Oldar Bedo as opposed to actually racing properly. He took the name Elan Mak as a disguise. Evidently, the fact that this was just his name turned backwards was more than enough to prevent anyone with the knowledge of his family from realising that this was indeed Cam Nail. He may as well have held a newspaper in front of his face and it still would have worked. Anyway, Elan Mak had a brief interruption prior to the race when he was confronted by rookie bounty hunter Rango Tell. The hunter had been hired by the same smuggler who ordered his father killed, as there was a justified fear Cam would take up the reins and prove troublesome to Nail. Tell believed his so-called Mandalorian armour, actually a shoddy vac exposure suit the young man had been conned into buying, would protect him and that he was faster on the draw. It wouldn't, he wasn't, and he died for it. When it came to the actual race, Cam set out to achieve his goal. Remarkably, the frankly dreadful craft managed to avoid getting destroyed. And while Cam would not manage to kill old Arbedo, unsurprisingly, his pod racer was way too slow and outclassed, he finished in 5th place. Actually kind of sucks to be Boz Raw, who finished 6th behind that scrap heap. Now known as Elan Mak on the circuit, our intrepid racer found he quite enjoyed pod racing and continued to mark out a career in it while trying to kill old Arbedo, failing all the while. Apart from earning track favourite status on the Doug Derby circuit, most of Elan Mak's pod racing career was centred around attempting to kill Beto. He came very close in 26 BBY during a race on Useron, getting into a brawl with his rival after Beto crashed into Mak's racer, wrecking both vehicles. But he ultimately did not succeed. He did, however, manage to keep racing by upgrading his old Kurtob pod racer, so credit to him. When he eventually took full control of his father's criminal empire, Cam Nail decided to step back from pod racing and sent mercenaries out to capture Beto. At some point during his career, the magazine Pod Racing Quarterly wound up undertaking a little investigation into Elan Mak and his activities. This would perhaps be a factor that ultimately led to his exposure as a crime lord in 22 BBY. Ironically enough, at the time he finally managed to get his hands on old Arbedo. This particular scandal was one of many which ultimately contributed to the downfall of pod racing. And Cam Nail still didn't manage to kill old Arbedo. Elan Mak's pod racer is a rather old Kurtob KRT 410C model, which was considered somewhat outclassed back in 40 years before the Battle of Yavin, let alone 32 BBY. We'll use BBY and ABY as needed. Given it was first made in around 72 BBY, by modern standards, modern being the time of the Phantom Menace, this clunker sported fairly iffy top speed, shoddy traction, and bad handling, but did possess a very powerful boost setup. This could push its top speed to around 820 km an hour, up from its listed non-boosting top speed of 420 km an hour. But its cooling system, perhaps a little unsurprisingly, given everything I've mentioned here, was also crap. The cockpit is 2.03 metres long, and the engines are 3.81 metres long. It is perhaps the smallest craft on the circuit. Interestingly enough, Mak would actually upgrade this pod racer over time rather than buying a new one and make it, well, less crap, basically. Let's see what it does, because as we can see, Elan Mak's stats are not impressive on paper. Let's see how it goes when he actually winds up buying a few parts. Can we salvage this? So, interestingly enough, I believe he is meant to have tattoos or certain patterning on his head, even though it kind of looks like he has a horrible skin disease on the Nintendo 64 textures. Traction is, well, it's about halfway. Turning, on the other hand, does actually wind up being pretty good. Give him credit for that. Acceleration, not fantastic. Probably around about average or a little lower. He will be just shy of top speed with a block 5, which is pretty much, well, I guess it's essentially the standard. Everyone will reach top speed with a block 6, to the best of my knowledge. Air brake does turn out surprisingly decent, but then again, it's not that hard to pick up good braking. Cooling systems, roundabout average. And repair, given all the work he had to do on it, actually winds up going alright. So he's not entirely unsalvageable, but he is a bit lacking in certain areas. Well, there we have it. A selection of times from Elan Mak which are within about a second of each other all told, but which are also a bit on the longer side. It's no surprise that Elan Mak's pod racer winds up being a bit of a clunker in this as well. He's pretty much the game's joke character, so he tried. We'll at least give him credit for that, but he did at least do a good job of maintaining his pod racer. Anyway, it's kind of unfortunate that we've gone from Clegg Holdfast, who was sitting on 4th, all the way to Elan Mak, whose best time sits in at 2 minutes 3.515 seconds, so he is only better on the board than Oldar, Beto and Sebulba. Dudbold, the guy whose name suggests he's a joke character, is still a bit better than him, though not really by much. Anyway, that does it for this episode. Next time, we will be looking at Neverkey and Bozzy Boranta, and the latter is a complete pain in the ass to actually try and unlock. Abyss is one of the worst tracks I have ever encountered in a racing game. And given how much I hate Mario Kart, that's saying something. Anyway, as always, thank you very much for joining me. Until next time, this is Red 2 returning to base. May the Force be with you.